So I could probably spend, we could probably take a whole year and look at the Gospel of Matthew. It's one of my favorite of the Gospels. In fact, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, is probably one of the most written about sections of the New Testament. Between all of Christian writing, scholarship especially, devotional materials, etc. The Sermon on the Mount is one of the most written about. In fact, I'll never forget, I had a professor in college who used to teach at Southwestern Seminary in the PhD program. He said, one of the staple texts in scholarship in both the big areas of New Testament scholarship in Germany and in Great Britain, you almost automatically go to the Sermon on the Mount first. And we'll hit a few highlights from there. But I want to talk about just some of the neat intricacies of the Gospel of Matthew that point back to the Old Testament. The Gospel of Matthew is probably one of the most Jewish, in some ways, of the Gospels. Now, there's a mode of scholarship that some scholars have noticed an interesting way the Gospel is organized. You have let me use these big words here. I should use the black, shouldn't I? Narrative and discourse. Narrative is essentially telling a story. Jesus went here, did this, healed this person. Discourse is teaching material. Sermon on the Mount is discourse. Chapter 5 through 7 of Matthew's Gospel is discourse. Well, the thing is, there are alternations of discourse and narrative material in the Gospel of Matthew. Depending on who you look at, some scholars say chapters 1 through 4 is narrative, 5 through 7 is discourse, 8 through 9 narrative, and so on and so forth. Now, when you lay this out, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 discourse sections. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 discourse sections, and how you label it off there. 5 discourse sections. And one of the observations that some Bible scholars have noticed is that this notion of 5 is not unintentional. That it points to the books of Moses, the Pentateuch, right? Y'all familiar with what the word Pentateuch means, aren't you? Books of Moses, Genesis, Deuteronomy. Penta means 5, right? So most good Jewish people would call it the Torah, the instruction, the wisdom, or the teaching. Well, there are 5 books of Moses, 5 great teachings of Moses. Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, has 5 great discourse sections. 5 great teaching sections. Now, the connections of the Old Testament doesn't just stop there. There are at least 11 instances of this notion of this phrase, that it, or variations of this, that it might be fulfilled. In various translations put it different ways. That notion of promise and fulfillment. And what this is this phrase appears multiple times in Matthew to connect something with the Old Testament, a promise from the Old Testament, to the life of Jesus. One of the instances of virgin birth in Matthew chapter 1 is linked back to a quote from Isaiah 7:14. So it might be fulfilled the words of the prophet. Is one of the big expressions in Matthew. The flight to Egypt in Matthew chapter 2 is a link to Hosea 11. The burning of the innocents in chapter 2 is linked to Jeremiah 31:15. The move to Capernaum in chapter 4 is linked to Isaiah chapter 9. The healing ministry of Jesus in chapter 8 of Matthew is linked to Isaiah 53. Jesus' healing ministry in chapter 12 is linked to Isaiah 42. Jesus' teaching and reasoning in parables in Matthew 13 is linked to Isaiah chapter 6. The call story of Isaiah, where it talks about preaching to people who won't hear, they won't see, ears are stopped up, essentially. Jesus' teaching in parables in 13:35 is linked to Psalm 78:2. Jesus entering Jerusalem in Matthew 21 is linked to Isaiah 62 and Zechariah chapter 9. And the fate of Judas in chapter 27 is linked to Zechariah 11, Jeremiah 18, and Jeremiah 32. So that it might be fulfilled, the words of the prophet. So there's a strong connection between the Old Testament and the promises of the Old Testament and the life of Jesus. There's continuity. There's nothing new. In fact, one of my favorite sections of Matthew, of course, is the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20 begins this whole antitheses section. You've heard it said this, but I say this. Okay? Let me read chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. This is from the NIV. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law. Now, Torah is oftentimes thought of as law. Okay, or a better probably way to translate that would be instruction as far as Torah. Do not think that I have come to abolish the Torah, the law, or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them, to bring them to completion. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of the pen, was it King James calls it a jot and tittle. Hebrew words. This is the sacred name of God. Yod, He, Vav, He have little jots and tittles and dots. This is one of those jots and tittles, that Yod there. Not one letter, not one stroke of the pen will disappear. Will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. So Jesus is saying here, I didn't come to do away with the Old Testament. I didn't come to do away with the promises of God. I didn't come to do away with our history. Okay? Verse 19 says, therefore anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments and teaches accordingly, will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So it's a notion of fulfillment of the law. Okay? So there's a big emphasis in Matthew, again, of that continuity, Old Testament and Jesus. Now the problem is, we find in the Gospel of Matthew that there's a bit of a rub of who's interpreting the old ways right. Okay? In fact, you find these antitheses in chapter 5. You've heard it said long ago, you shall not murder. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with your brother or sister will be subject to judgment. You've heard that it say, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. What's that famous line that Jimmy Carter's credited with? I had lust in my heart. Divorce. It has been said, anyone who divorces a wife must give her certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her a victim of adultery. Oaths. You've heard it said that to people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So in these antitheses, Jesus is not doing away with the law. He's doing away with the interpretation of the law.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that he's doing away with what God already done in tradition and the right things, the old ways. It's just the people around him have been interpreting maybe in the wrong way or doing it the wrong way. One of my favorite chapters over in Matthew, one of the favorite things is, I got to find here, is Jesus, he really lets the Pharisees have it. He calls them brood of vipers and whitewashed tombs. And Matthew chapter 23, let me find one. Let's see here. Here it is. these woes. Woe to you, teachers of law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut your door to the kingdom of heaven, people's faces. Woe to you, teachers, skipping verses here and there. Verse 15 now. Woe to you, teachers of law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! Which, by the way, you ever heard of the origins of the word hypocrite? It comes from, especially the Hippocrates, the Greek word, comes from the theater. Back in ancient theater in Greece, you never saw the actor's face. They had a mask on. And there's usually an expression like smiley face or sad face or whatever. So you didn't know what the actor's expression was, you just know it was on the mask. So you got a mask showing you one thing, but the actor may be doing something else behind the mask. You know, it's kind of, the two-faced. You ever heard that expression, two-faced? How many are two-faced? Raise your hand. Okay. Dadgummit. Thought I'd trick you into it. But you blind guides, verse 16. What are you blind guides? You blind fools. Jesus really insults these fellas. 23. Woe to you, teachers of law, you hypocrites. 25. Woe to you, teachers of law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You blind Pharisees, verse 26. 27. This is one of my favorite ones. Woe to you, teachers of law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You are like whitewashed tombs. You look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside you're full of bones of the dead and everything unclean. Grandpa used to have this expression, it's like a bricked up outhouse. It looks good on the outside, but it ain't that good on the inside. It just ain't right. And I always ask the Grandpa, does bricked up outhouse they have the fancy catalogs inside? Oh, mercy. But see, one of the things we find in the Gospel of Matthew, there's this tension between Jesus and the old, not say the old ways, but the old ways were viewed. Okay? That they didn't quite have it right. One of the things, I think, one of the tensions I found in this church and other churches, and I hear about all over, and regardless of denomination, is, and this has been going on for years, different ways and different issues, old and new ways. And one of the things in this church has been music, right? Yes, y'all know it's true. It's still going on. What's that, Carol?
I said, it doesn't matter what we know, it doesn't change anything.
I know, I'm just saying, there's tension. And the thing is, that's nothing new under the sun, is there? There was a point in most Baptist churches where you wouldn't find a piano in a Baptist church because it was too associated with pool halls and ladies of the night, their dens, things like that. Times have changed. There was primitive Baptists. They come from a strand of Baptists that didn't have music, played music. They didn't have music at all, really. In fact, I started reading this book by Johnny Cash called, was it Trains, Prisons, and Jesus or something like that? It's written by a guy who teaches at Abilene Christian University, and he comes from that Church of Christ tradition. They used to didn't have music; they sang four-part harmony. Now that denomination has changed, and they're allowing music in, instruments, whatever. But there's this tension between the old ways and new ways, right? And that's been going on for years. I'm sure when y'all were younger, there was some sort of tension going on between, this and that. So, maybe music, it may be how we do things. We've never done it that way before. Now, is that, the issue is, how much do we throw out the old ways or keep the old ways? How much do we need to let the new ways in or not let them in? And that's one of the big debates in churches. I don't think there's one blanket statement for every church, right? But the reason I connected with this is one of the things that Jesus did was he didn't throw out the old ways. He didn't throw out the scripture. He didn't throw out what God had taught and what God had done for the people. He remembered it. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew's a skilled writer. One of the things that Matthew does is the way he presents Jesus. Jesus is almost like he's the new Moses. Moses is one of the par excellence leaders in Judaism. The writings of Moses, the Torah of Moses. Moses is this. Moses is amazing. But Jesus is the new Moses. One of the ways is the fact that there's 5 discourse sections, 5 teaching sections, like the 5 books of Moses. But even the story of Jesus, between chapters 1 and 2 of the beginning of Jesus' story, there are several instances where the life of Moses and the life of Jesus have some overlap. Now, some of this is not in the Old Testament, but it was in some of the writings that some of the Jewish people would have known at the time of Jesus. One example is in the book, Pseudo-Philo's book, the Liber Antiquitum Biblicarum, chapter 9, verse 13. I actually did a paper on that one time, I think, that book. Rewritten Scripture, yeah. Miriam has a dream where an angel foretells Moses saving his people. See, the LAB, this book I talked about, Pseudo-Philo's work, is a retelling of the story of Moses in the Old Testament. So, in that tradition, Miriam has a dream saying that, that Moses needs to be saved. Angel comes to Miriam and says, hey, get your son out of here. That mirrors Matthew chapter 1, verse 21, Joseph's dream, talking about Jesus for saving his people. Matthew chapter 2, Jesus' birth is followed by Herod slaughtering the infants. That mirrors Pharaoh's murder of the children during Moses' time, in the book of Exodus. There's several other instances. There's the angel commands Joseph and his family to come back to Israel after the death of Herod, Matthew chapter 2. Well, Moses was commanded to return to Egypt after the death of Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 4. Jesus takes his family back to Israel, Matthew 2:21, and Moses takes his family back to Egypt in Exodus 4:20. There's all these different overlaps, different notions of the story of Moses and the story of Jesus. And Matthew highlights that because he wants to remind us that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. He's the teacher of the law. What's that one expression that we find in the Gospels? He teaches like one who has authority. You see, these scribes and Pharisees, they had memorized the old scriptures. They knew the text. They knew the laws of the prophets. Every jot and every tittle, they knew it. But they didn't have the authority because they didn't write it. They weren't the impetus behind it. But Jesus was. So, we find Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. And Matthew points that out very much so through the discourse narratives, through the teachings, through it might be fulfilled through portraying Jesus as a new Moses. We find this notion that Jesus is what's right. There's continuity there. One of my convictions is there's, especially when we get back to that conversation about old and new ways and tradition and new things. I think sometimes when you gut things and get rid of the old ways totally, you throw out the baby with bathwater. In my experience in life, for those who are older than myself, I can learn things from them. And also conversely, there's some that are older with me that probably could learn something from me. Case in point, some of y'all have electronic devices. When they mess up, who do you turn to?
The younger ones.
The younger ones, right? I read an article, I think it was the Associated Baptist Press, or one of those organizations put an article out. They may have been curating it from somewhere else about, there's a church somewhere, I think maybe in the Midwest maybe, that started this program. It's a mentor program between the senior adults of the church and the youth. Not just youth in the church, but youth from all over. And it's essentially a give and take relationship. The senior adults, the gray hairs, if you will, which I'm getting there, they offer life advice to these teenagers that they may not have experienced, and maturity and mentorship. And conversely, the teenagers, they teach the older crowd about the electronics and the social media and how to navigate these things. And it's a good partnership of working together. But anyway. So the Gospel of Matthew, we find this connection to the Old Testament, reinterpretation of the law and Judaism, and the right teaching, I guess you could say. But one of the neat things about the Gospel of Matthew is Jesus is portrayed as the teacher par excellence. In fact, one of the big emphases in the Gospel of Matthew that the Gospel writer emphasizes is this notion of discipleship, right? Great Commission, anybody know the Great Commission off the top of your head? Go ye therefore.
Go ye therefore and teach all nations baptizing in the name of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Holy Ghost.
Say it 5 times fast.
Number 5. I learned when I was in GAs.
I told you. I memorized Jesus wept, John 11:35. Okay. I used to tell you the Royal Ambassador stuff, the Royal Ambassador motto and pledge and all that stuff. I forgot it. Sorry. Where was I going? You threw me, Patty, by memorizing it. Oh, Great Commission. Go ye therefore and make disciples, right? That's one of the big calls in Matthew is making disciples. Now, the word disciple, Latin discipula, literally get from Latin, means student. Well, the word in Greek, didaskale or didaskalos, means student or teacher. Mathetize is the word for disciple. But there's this teacher-student relationship. In fact, Jesus is portrayed as being a great teacher. In fact, Sermon on the Mount, which, by the way, another connection with Moses. Where did Moses go to get the 10 Commandments?
Mount
On
Sinai.
the mountain. Where did Jesus go to give his great teaching, the Sermon on the Mount? Up on the mount. Right? And notice when beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, what does Jesus do? He doesn't stand up. He sits down. Great teachers in that day, especially in the Jewish context, they would sit down. And again, the narrative, the discourses, Jesus is teaching. He's trying to impart teachings into his students. And it's not just content transfer, right? The disciples of Jesus, it wasn't just him telling them what to do and that's it. It wasn't just being lectured to. It was practicing it, right? A great way to get somebody to learn something is not just impart knowledge to them, but then living it out. So what do? They learn about being disciples by traveling with Jesus and actually following him, watching him, and doing like him. And that's one of the things that discipleship is. It's learning to be like the Master. It's ethical commitment. It's love and righteousness. It's following him. Jesus' disciples in Gospel of Matthew are expected to love their enemies. Matthew chapter 5. The greatest commandment is love, Matthew 22. The golden rule, do unto others, essentially, chapter 7. And God's judgment is based on those who are loving and merciful, chapter 25. Their conduct, the disciples' conduct, is supposed to be righteous, right conduct. Bible characters are called righteous. Joseph, chapter 1. Abel, chapter 23. Jesus praises righteousness as a virtue, chapter 5, verse 6 and 10. Disciples are not to do their righteous deeds in order to be seen. That's one of my favorite parts of the Sermon on the Mount, too. There's so much stuff. We could do a whole month on the Sermon on the Mount. Do a whole year on the Sermon on the Mount. 6. Let's see. Got the right citation here. 6:1. Okay. Well, pages are sticking together. No wonder it goes on the wrong chapter. 6:1. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. Don't do it for show, right? So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as some of the hypocrites do in the synagogues, on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you that you have received the reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. He goes on to talk about prayer too. Pray in private, not let's see. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, pray to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. So this notion of don't live life. Don't live your life out as a disciple just to be seen, to be heard, to toot your own horn. How many people are like that in churches today? I did this. Well, people in the culture in general, but even in the church. I did this, I did that. There are some ministers, even in town, this town, actually I guess that church is just outside town limits, so the Dallas community, we got a Dallas address, who, it has to be about their church. If they partner with another church, it's about that church. And if it's not just about that certain church, but it's about that pastor. He wants to be front and center. He wants his name out there, and I ain't saying any names you might can guess. But that's not what Jesus called us to do, is it? Not do it to be seen. My newsletter article for March and April is talking about this notion that secularism. Charles Taylor, philosopher, wrote several books about secularism, around secularism. And one of the things he talks about is this notion of people's moral center, their sense of purpose. In the non-secular age, religious age, I should say, there was this notion of our sense of morality and being outside of ourselves. We found purpose in God. We found meaning in God. We found our morality in God and religion. Then the rise of the secular age is very much internal. How does this benefit me? Whether intentional or not, people ask that question. In fact, one of the illustrations I read was essentially, even in a marriage relationship in the secular age today, some people don't necessarily marry somebody or stay married to somebody because they love them, but because what that person does for them. Or even because I'm a better person because I'm married to that person. It's a self thing. It's a selfish thing.
Depends on how good of a back scratcher they are.
Is that all she is to you? She's a pretty darn good cookie maker too. What do you offer her besides annoying her? That's what my wife wonders too.
I write a few checks every once in a while.
I know. Well, I annoy the heck out of my wife, but I think the notion is if I didn't annoy her and I wasn't around, she'd probably starve or eat out too much. So.
Question about
Yes, sir.
where we are, Matthew.
Yeah.
Talking about his teaching.
Yeah.
And about the use of the term, the Lord's Prayer.
Uh-huh.
And when it was a teaching model prayer, and the term of the Lord's Prayer probably needs to jump over there to John, somewhere where he's, John 17, maybe, whatever it is, where he's actually praying the Lord's Prayer in the Gethsemane before. What do you think? Does that give a misnomer to what the Lord's Prayer really is by seeing it as the model prayer, the way we're supposed to pray, as opposed to the way he actually prayed?
Well, I don't think it's. When you look at the Lord's Prayer as a model prayer, I don't think it's something that has to be done every time in every way. Because if you look in the greater context of Scripture, a lot of the Psalms are prayers. And, we model them in some ways, but they're not exactly like the Lord's Prayer. And then there's elements I think that we should include in our prayers from the Lord's Prayer. That should be something we've done and everything. The question is, one of my big questions is, and it's been batted about amongst great thinkers and philosophers and theologians and scholars, is when you look at the high standards set by the Sermon on the Mount, it's a really high standard. The question is, do we have to live up to that standard? Or is it something we're supposed to aim for? See what I'm saying? There's a difference. I'm of the conviction that high standard is what we're supposed to aim up for. There's some groups that take it really literally, and that's what they do. I mean, turn the other cheek. And that's some of the groups like the Amish and Mennonite, especially some of those Anabaptist groups, they are really literal on how they interpret, retaliation against the enemy. Turn the other cheek. A few years ago, that shooting at that one Amish school. Forgiveness and love to that shooter. It was a great Christian example. How many of us were able to do that?
We were there the day of the funeral. Just happened to be coming back through there.
Yeah.
And two of the ladies that had children killed had gone to minister to the family of the shooter.
Yeah.
And had taken a meal and worship with them. So they were showing us that when we came through on the bus.
It's amazing, isn't it? I don't see myself being able to do it. Much as I would like to think myself a good Christian person. It'd be hard for me to do. So yeah. And one thing before we leave, before we dismiss, I think Jennifer's already here, but there's a bunch of different stuff in Matthew's Gospel. One of the things that we've talked about before is genealogy. We've talked about around Christmas time, I think it was, we talked about the women in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew. And these women are, women have sexual issues associated with them, Tamar and Ruth and all them. And another thing to mention too, well, that's good enough, I think. I think I beat a dead horse, but that's some of my favorite things about the Gospel of Matthew. It's a lot of stuff there. It's really rich. Next week we'll talk about the Gospel of Luke. How about that? One of the things about the Gospel of Luke, you've got Matthew is very Jewish, very much connection with the Old Testament and Old ways, and you got Luke, who's probably a Gentile, and he's very much emphasizes Jesus' ministry to the Gentiles. So you've got this kind of disconnect. You got the old ways and you got the new ways. So let's be dismissed in prayer, and we'll